speakers who are going to give a quick overview of their work before we get into the discussion. I'd like to start by welcoming Dave Bartley. Dave is a principal investigator at the Moredun with over 30 years of experience in veterinary parasitology. Dave's research focuses on improving diagnostics and control strategies for roundworm infections in livestock, particularly regarding anthelmintic resistance. His current projects explore the transmission risks of nematodes, the development of genomic resources for monitoring resistance, and strategies to mitigate greenhouse gas emissions through good parasite management. So, Dave, over to you for 5-7 minutes.
Says it's not working.
So should we'll swap the order around in that case, if that's all right with both of you, and we'll go to you first, Phil, and then to Stu. So let me just do a quick introduction to Phil Skuce. And Phil is principal scientist at Moredun, having worked there for the past 30 years on various aspects of sustainable control of parasites, worms and flukes generally, mainly in livestock. He's also the Scottish Government, the Scottish Environment, Food and Agricultural Research Institute's gateway knowledge broker for livestock. That's Safari. A lot of you will have heard of the Safari network. Phil also sits on the SCOP steering committee, as regularly we see Stu and Dave Bartley as well, actually. But Phil is an active member of the SCOP steering committee with a particular responsibility around fluke and the environment working groups as well. So Phil, over to you. We're going to swap the order around with, I think we've lost Dave again, actually. He's he's very active this lunchtime, isn't he?
It just shows you how poor the Wi-Fi signal is at Moredun. So Stu and I
Phil,
decided
over
to
to
come
you.
home. Yeah, no, thanks Phil for the introduction. And we're quite often mixed up, the two Phil S's at Scops. But it's a pleasure to be asked to contribute today, to be one of the big three. And by that, I don't mean me, Dave and Stu. I mean worms, fluke and scab. I have a particular interest in the fluke side of things, and it's quite good that Dave and I are slightly back to back, because there are some parallels and things that we might draw out together. Unusually for me, I don't have any slides this time. I'm well known for talking to people to death about the fluke life cycle and how fascinating it is, and I'm quite happy to do that if anybody wants me to. But it was quite timely that this meeting has come up, because we actually had a Scops and Cows fluke group catch up as recently as Monday. So rather than sort of talk about research as such, I just thought I'd maybe talk about what we're kind of talking about and the sort of main issues for the industry. And I guess the main message I took away from Monday's meeting was that the messaging around fluke these days is that the sort of traditional seasonality has broken down largely. Risk has gone from being very predictable and strongly seasonal to a period of quite low and late infections to, I think, where we are now is quite unpredictable. The weather this year has been exceptional. I think we'd all agree, and that has implications for all of our parasites and other things. We had a very dry early spring and the hottest summer for many years. The Met Office are telling us to forget about 1976. It isn't even in the top 10 anymore. And that will have implications for fluke transmission and fluke risk. And it's interesting to see how that pans out. We had John Graham Brown from NADIS on the call on Monday. Now, John runs the actual algorithm that produces the NADIS liver fluke forecast, and I believe the autumn forecast is imminent. But it's behind a paywall, so I'm not privy to actually seeing it. But what I understand is that the forecast identifies the traditional fluke hotspots of the northwest of England and the west of Scotland as still remaining relatively high risk. Now, that algorithm, as you know, is based on temperature, rainfall and evapotranspiration. What it can't really account for across the country is the underlying ground conditions, and that has a lot to say about fluke risk. So the forecast is useful and interesting and all the rest of it, but I think there's more at play with fluke in terms of the ground conditions and who's grazing where and when. Because the areas that are identified are, you could argue, are nearly always wet. I just want to make the point that although we're a research laboratory, we don't actively perform diagnosis or surveillance for fluke. We do some field work, I guess, but we're very reliant on veterinary services like APHA and SAC, as well as the abattoirs to help us and provide us with up-to-date information on what's happening in the field. And the basic messaging from APHA and SAC this year is that they're seeing some chronic fluke, but it's fairly patchy and unpredictable, and little or no evidence yet of acute fluke infections. That said, we're approaching what would be the typical peak fluke season now, so we'll see how that pans out. Just in terms of ongoing research, in inverted commas, I mean, most of the fluke work that we do at Moredun is quite practical, and it's been looking at liver fluke risk associated with agri-environment schemes. That's very much a Scottish Government interest as well, and specifically wetland, woodland, and most recently peatland. Now, we actually have a new case study about to be published that we did with Peatland Action, which are part of Nature Scot. So I can send a link to that when that goes live. But that's just trying to provide some evidence around the actual fluke risk associated with peatland grazing and associated activities. But basically, I mean, I think what brings it home to me, I guess, in terms of the changing weather patterns and these different grazing scenarios where animals are more involved in conservation grazing, is that the best advice is test, don't guess. We can sit and pontificate about what we think the fluke risk is like or where we think a snail habitat is. The best indicator of what's actually happening on the ground is the animals that are grazing these areas. So I think it's important from our perspective, and we're in quite a good position with fluke in a way that we have a number of diagnostic tests. We don't just rely on an egg count. But for us and for me, I think it's important that people know what tests are available. I mean, there's been a new development very recently with the lateral flow version of the liver fluke blood test that's been marketed through Norbrook. So that's nice to see something, and that's potentially Penside. So that, that's a nice new development. But I think it's important across the board to know what tests are available and what those tests tell you about a fluke infection. That can inform whether you need to treat, which product to use, and whether that product's worked or not. And if you do need to treat, and I think the same applies to the flukicides, they're quite unusual in the sense that they kill different stages of fluke infection. Some will kill immatures and adults, some will only kill adults. So I think it's important that people know what age of fluke you're trying to deal with and what sort of the different flukicides cover, so that they're using the most appropriate product and proving that it works. So it's about don't treat if you don't have to, optimize treatments when you can, use the right product and prove it works. So a lot of that applies to what Dave and Stu will talk about as well. And there's lots of good reasons to optimize flukicide use as it is with antibiotics or any other veterinary medicines, because we're reducing the selection pressure then for resistance. We're reducing residues in meat and milk. We're reducing wasted effort and wasted money. We're also reducing potential environmental impacts, because most, if not all, of our frontline flukicides have the potential to kill off-target invertebrates when they encounter them in the environment. And we're all very familiar now with dung beetles and all the rest of it. But I would just like to point folk on the call, and I'm sure they already know about these, but the Skuce podcast series that Dave and Stu and I and others contribute to, I think they're really excellent. They usually involve vets and farmers in the field as well. And they all cover all sorts of topics, scab and worms and fluke and environment and all sorts of things. And I think there's a fairly recent fluke one either just out or coming out. And there's also a press release pending from Skuce about fluke this year. So I'll leave it there, and quite happy to take any questions after Dave and Stu have finished. If there's any specific issues that people are aware of or just want to ask about, I'll leave it there and hope I haven't overstayed my welcome.
No, definitely not, Phil. Thanks very much for that. Yeah, some good points there. And just to concur with you around those Skuce podcasts as well. So I've entered that word of podcasts recently, and they're really good. Some of those Skuce podcasts, I've not got through them all yet, but they're really good. Well worth the time listening to. Is Dave with us now or not? I can't see his name there. Actually, he's not.
No, I think disappeared at the moment.
Yeah. Stu, we'll come to you then in that case.
Okay,
and
awesome.
And we'll see whether Dave joins us again or not. And if not, maybe Phil, you might be able to just give a little bit of an overview of what Dave was hoping to cover. You might be able to. We'll see as we go through. But Stu, just to introduce Stu Burgess. Stu is the head of the Vaccines and Diagnostics Department at the Moredun. He also leads the sheep scab research group, which focuses on developing novel tools for the control of sheep scab. Recent developments include a commercially available sheep scab blood test, which can detect infested animals before the appearance of clinical signs, and also the first prototype sheep scab vaccine, which significantly reduces mite numbers and the size of skin lesions, offering a more sustainable method of scab control for the future. Stu also leads several sheep scab control programs across the UK, including a rural development program in England that concluded a year or so ago, and a BBSRC funded control program in Northern Ireland, and the Scottish Government funded control program on the Western Isles of Lewis and Harris, which I know Stu is still actively involved in. So, Stu, over to you. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Phil. I'm not specifically going to talk about vaccination today, but I'm very happy to answer questions, around the sort of development of the sheep scab vaccine. But today I'm just going to mostly focus on control using our existing tools, which are diagnostics and the treatments that we have available. So I'll just talk about some of the kind of challenges really that we face with sheep scab at the moment, and then what the opportunities are for us to be able to overcome those challenges and limitations. So sheep scab, for those of you who've been lucky enough not to experience it in flocks, is caused by infestation of the sheep scab mite Sauroptes ovis, that you can hopefully see up there in the top right corner. It is endemic in the UK. Last time we estimated this was about nearly 20 years ago, and at that point 10 to 15% of farmers had experienced sheep scab. I think we're probably a little bit further now than that, and the costs have certainly accelerated. So now we're looking at 80 to 200 million pounds per year. The signs of disease really include itching, rubbing, wool loss, restlessness, and they're really well described in this picture by Neil Sargison at the Dick Vet. And you can just see in the foreground there, you can see the animal that's got quite a bit of wool loss on across the withers, and animals at the back there that are doing kind of rubbing, scratching against fence posts and nibbling away at their own fleeces. So it's a really quite distressing disease and important for production losses, but also obviously from a welfare perspective. So scab's predominantly spread by direct contact with infested sheep, but it can be spread through handling facilities, across fences. Of course, if we're only using single fencing, then it's pretty easy for scab to get across from flock to flock. And also if we're relying on things like common grazing, then it's a really easy way for scab to spread across flocks. There is also another issue in terms of there being carrier sheep that aren't necessarily at that time showing clinical signs of disease, but can still be carrying those mites and still represent a risk of infestation to other flocks. And I think quite a lot of scab is quite innocently moved around the country because people just aren't aware at that particular time that their animals are infested with scab. The mite can live off the host for about 2 to 3 weeks, and that does complicate control. And that means that we have to be very careful around the treatments that we use to control sheep scab. So one of those treatments that we have in our kind of locker are the macrocyclic lactone, or ML, injectables. And not all of those injectables provide protection against reinfestation. So when you are using those, it's really important to ensure that, let's say, for example, you're using a product containing doramectin, like, for example, Dectomax, that you're able to move those animals immediately on treatment to fresh pasture. Otherwise, they will simply get reinfested again, and the cycle will sadly continue. But some of those injectables do provide lasting protection, and so it's where we can use those that may be sensible in certain circumstances. But whatever we do, we only have 2 classes of drugs. We've got those ML injectables and then organophosphate or OP plunge dipping. That's pretty much what we have at the moment. And so in terms of diagnosing scab, then classically your vet would come out and look at clinical signs, of course. And but now we do have a blood test, a very sensitive and specific blood test for sheep scab, that can pick up the appearance before clinical signs, and that's a bit of a game changer really for us. So previously you would look for, this is a pretty obvious case of scab. You can see a lot of wool loss here and some pretty shabby looking fleeces, particularly with this ewe here on the left with the red arrows. But then in this sort of younger lamb, you can see areas of discoloration there, where the lamb's just been nibbling away at its own fleece. And so your vet would come in, do a skin scraping, and then hopefully find one of those under the microscope, and that would give you your definitive diagnosis. But the problem is, because you're really reliant on clinical signs and obvious lesions in order to do that skin scraping, the sensitivity of that skin scraping method can be as low as 1 in 5, and so that's a pretty poor diagnostic technique. And that's why Moredun developed a blood test for detecting sheep scab, and it picks it up before you see the clinical signs. So it is really the first time we can actually now get ahead of scab, and that's been a critical tool for a lot of those control programs that Phil spoke about at the start there. So there's a number of challenges to control a scab. One of the ones I mentioned was that over-reliance on just 2 classes of drugs, and at this stage, no new drugs on the horizon, although hopefully that vaccine will come in, but that's still going to be, probably 5 years away. I keep saying 5 years, but it needs to be a rolling 5 years. Routine whole flock treatment. So people are still doing prophylactic treatments for sheep scab. Now, if you're in a high risk area where you've got lots of contiguous properties, or you're sharing common grazing, then that might actually make sense. But in a lot of cases, you're probably just wasting your money, and they're often not going to be necessary. So you've got to think about how you use these drugs, and you want to maintain their efficacy for when you really need them. And that should certainly form part of your kind of quarantine when you're bringing new animals onto farm. Non-validated means of control. So this relates particularly to the OP dips. So they are OP plunge dips. They are only to be used in plunge dipping, not through showers and jetters. And that's really important, because I was watching an episode of Farming Life 2 nights ago from last year. And one of the farmers had sort of put together an old dipping trailer and was very proudly using that, and that was great. However, none of those animals were in that dip tank for any more than 20 seconds, and that's just not effective. The animals have to be in that dip tank for a full minute. Now, he was, in all fairness, plunging their head under twice, which is great, and that has to happen in that minute. But there was no way those animals were getting a full dose of that chemical, and that's the concern. So if you are using those, make sure you do them properly, and showers and jetters are not efficacious for controlling scab. There are some current issues around the disposal of spent OP dip. Trying to find, if you're using a contractor, for example, then those contractors finding suitable routes for safe disposal are currently quite challenging, and we are working with government and with the industry to try to resolve those. However, if you're doing your own dipping, or if you have a land disposal site, then that's obviously far less complicated. So that's a nice route if you've got that available. The other advantage we have is that scab is actually focused in clusters or hotspots, and these form critical control points for control. So this map just highlights some of those hotspots, and Phil alluded to the RDP program, which is running around kind of the Welsh border regions, the southwest in Devon and Cornwall, and then the northwest of England. And he also mentioned about the project up on Lewis and Harris. And again, this very kind of red sort of glow around Lewis and Harris at the top left of this picture highlights the risk of sheep scab on Lewis and Harris, and not necessarily the amount of sheep scab there. But it just shows that if they do want to get on top of it, they need support, and that's what that project's trying to achieve. And then also really important, and that's highlighted through those projects, that we have to work together to get rid of scab. Just one farmer trying to deal with it in isolation is not going to cut it. And that's really what we've been trying to battle through for the last 20 to 30 years since we deregulated scab control. And it has got us, unfortunately, nowhere. And that's why we have to do this collective working. There are issues again around resistance to the macrocyclic lactones, and we first reported that about 7 years ago now, and we've got pretty clear evidence of that spreading across the UK. So if we look at the lack of efficacy reports that have been filed through the VMD, the Veterinary Medicines Directorate, they can see them on this graph here. So that resistance started around the English-Welsh border region. That's where we first identified that. And then these are high confidence lack of efficacy reports. So we're pretty confident that the drugs in these cases have been administered correctly. They just haven't worked. And we've had cases of those resistant mites certainly in the southwest, across England, Scotland, and also in Northern Ireland now as well. And my very final point here is that what is, again, another hopefully little bit of light there, is that those resistant mites can still be effectively controlled using an OP plunge dip. So if you are seeing lack of efficacy with any of the injectables, first of all, it doesn't make sense to move to another injectable because it's the same active. And so resistance to one will confer resistance to all of those injectables. You then have to go to a plunge dip. That's the only way that you're going to be able to control the disease in those scenarios. So apologies for being a bit doom and gloom, but I think there's quite a lot of positives still in there. They're just perhaps a little bit well hidden, but I'm happy to explore those in the question session. So
great.
Thank you.
Thanks a lot, Stu, and I'm sure there will be questions and discussion on that in a moment. And again, you know, sadly, scab seems to be an ongoing sore within this industry. And you know, I think you've shown over these last few years that the only way, the best way, and probably the only way, is through coordinated activity, really, where people work together. But sure, we'll come back to that in a moment. Dave, while we've got you, great, it's good. Welcome back. And I've introduced you already, so let me pass straight over to you now.
Well, thank you very much, and apologies for that. Yeah, Phil, apologies. I've commandeered your office, so apologies for that. I could not get my system to work.
It's lovely and tidy, isn't it? I kept it nice and tidy.
It's much nicer than my office. I might move in. It'd be lovely. Anyway, other than the internal politics of office movements, yeah, I was challenged to talk about roundworms. So maybe that's what we should focus on. Yeah, as you all know, there's plenty of different types of roundworms that we have across the UK, and they have varying different timings. But actually, what we're starting to find is that those timings are merging, and that we're starting to see issues across the piece, and that certainly has been this year. And what I've got here is really the things that have sort of vexed folk over the last little while. And by the last little while, I mean the last few months. Homunculus, this blood-feeding parasite, I'm sure most of you have heard of it, if not all of you. It's a voracious blood feeder. It's a parasite that we have had in the UK for a very, very long time. We've done studies, 20 years ago, and it was here. We know that we can find it on about half of the farms when we look for it, and certainly that was the case. But what we have started to see is a bigger concern about this parasite in particular, with it having a change in epidemiology. And part of that we think is because of our changing seasons. As we all know, I think you only just have to look outside. We really don't know what we're going to get, and but what we are getting is that generally we're getting milder and wetter winters, and that's fabulous for this parasite. It was a tropical parasite originally, but actually it's very much adapting to our circumstances. We did some work, I don't know, 10 years ago, where we were looking at overwintering, and we found that this parasite could overwinter even up here in Scotland. We're the same sort of latitude as they are in Moscow, so we're quite high north. And we see that this was able to winter. But when we did the original studies, actually what we found is that the parasite died off as spring, summer came along. We repeated this study. We were able to repeat it because actually we ended up with clinical hemoncosis on our institute farm 2 years ago. Which was multi-resistant, which caused us a huge amount of problems, as you might have gathered. But one of the sort of opportunities that came from that was we could have another look at the overwintering. And what was actually quite scary is in preceding time, not only was it able to overwinter, we were able to see it in naive animals in January. We were able to find it in March and into the summer, and actually just to continue on later into the season. And this is something that's been held across the way. So it has vexed a lot of people. We had a workshop in the Sheep Veterinary Society. There's been a lot of discussions at Skuce about sort of diagnostics and treatment choices and timings, and we can talk a little bit more about that afterwards. But yeah, it has been one of these issues of how do we manage this parasite that it is becoming more of an issue in areas that we wouldn't have found it. And kind of one of the take-home messages from it is that we need to diagnose these things. You know, we need to use the tools that we have. You know, things there's a peanut agglutinin staining to allow us to find it. There are actually now fecal egg count technologies that can actually look at it on morphology, and that sort of technological one has brought both our ability to find these things, but it's also given us a challenge as to what we do with it. What is clinically relevant? Just because we find Homunculus doesn't mean that we need to worry necessarily about it within it, but we do need to build up those pictures. And I think that's part of what has been going on. So, and I think as well as the sort of machine learning AI, we're starting to see these sequencing technologies emerge where we can have a look at the total species in a farm, in a sample. And I think that gives us great opportunities. It's one of those holy grails that we've had, is being able to identify what species are causing problems on farm, what species are surviving treatment, and therefore what options do we have for it. But it does mean that we need to be prepared for that. You know, we need to be prepared for having those difficult conversations of, right, I am finding resistance in Cuperia, but only in that. How do I then manage that on farm? And I think that is something that all these new tools will give us more things to worry about going forward, more opportunities to get involved. But yeah, certainly in the short term, we're there. In final relation to that Homunculus one, we have developed off the back of ongoing discussions, we developed a newsletter, and that's available for those who are members on the Moredun website. So an unashamed plug for that. The second one in there of changing epidemiology, lungworm. I got contacted last year by folk who were concerned that we were starting to see lungworm dictycolus, filaria in sheep, and they were starting to see more condemnations at slaughter with it. You know, I'm sure, I didn't hear Phil's talk, but I'm sure that part of it was about liver condemnations there. But we are starting to see this, and interestingly, I was contacted at the beginning of this week from APHA, who were having that very same conversation. I've not had a chance to speak to them, but it was really just to raise awareness that it's not just things like Homunculus where we're starting to see epidemiology. We're starting to see it in things like lungworm, you know, and that sort of plasticity is there where we know they're developing. They only have one thing in life to do, which is to find a host and replicate, and they're very good at doing it. Anthelmintic resistance, there's not been a huge amount of work that I can report on. We haven't done very much. I know there is a study being undertaken in Wales, Ward 2. From talks, I know that they have resistance, at least to the increasing resistance to the first 3 classes of anthelmintics. I'm not sure how the other 2 are holding up. But yeah, that is something that is going forward. And it is something that we are going to have to deal with, is because I suspect we will start to see resistance to these as they become more readily used. You know, with StarTech being on the market, somebody did tell me it was difficult to get hold of, but it is something that as it gets used more, we will get more exposure and more likelihood of resistance developing. And the final part for mine was, again, another unashamed plug for a project that we're doing. It's a thematic network. It's a European one looking at sustainable parasite control. It has resources on there. Basically, what the project is looking at is how do we manage worms sustainably across Europe? Are there messages and things that we can learn from each other? So yeah, it's well worth a look at that website, as well as obviously looking at the Moredun one. And yeah, it's a year through, and basically we're looking at these things, and our part has been to look at the impact of species of selective breeding and what impact that might have on species. So we're in the middle of collecting from that. So that's really exciting. It's an exciting thing for us to get across, to sort of learn from each other from across Europe. And that probably is my 5 minutes up. So I will stop talking. Thank you very much.
Thanks, Dave. That's excellent. Brilliant. 3 great presentations there.